Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Sam Tatam is head of behavioral science at Ogilvy Consulting in London. It's a practice that combines leading research in cognitive psychology and behavioral economics. Sam's experience stems from a background in organizational psychology and brand strategy. Today, he brings this thinking to Ogilvy's clients across the globe, developing behavioral interventions and shaping the communications of some of the world's most powerful brands and organizations. Sam has a bachelor's in psychology from the University of Syndey and a master's in organizational psychology from Macquarie University. Sam, welcome to the show.
Fantastic, Nick. Thanks so much for having me.
Did I say that right, Macquarie? Is that?
You did. You said that right, Macquarie. So that's out in Australia.
Oh, good. Okay, excellent. So it's very good to have you on. Lots of things to cover. So I'm gonna dive right in. And I heard before, and you could feel free to fact check this, that you actually paid your way through uni by working in a bar. Is that correct?
That's true. That's true. Although I'm sure there are still some debts, but I certainly survived through uni working in a bar. I'm a big advocate for bar work.
I did too. For years, I did for most of my undergraduate, and then in between undergrad and grad school, I did as well. So at several different bars and restaurants. And I sort of half joke that any shred of expertise I might have of human psychology and human behavior is not attributed to my formal PhD training in psychology, but instead to my bar experience as a bartender. You get to learn a lot about humans. Would you say a similar thing from your experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think firstly from the sorts of discussions that you get to, but also the spectrum of people that you're able to meet and work with. And it's a very leveling experience, I think, hospitality. So I completely agree with you. What a fantastic sort of microcosm of society, and coming at it sometimes, certainly on a Saturday night when it's about sort of 1 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday night, and you're seeing sometimes society at its best.
Or its worst.
Or its worst, depending on how we see it.
I was at a bar restaurant right in the heart of what we call Bay Street. It's essentially Canada's Wall Street, sort of a mini version of Wall Street. So you can imagine the type of clientele that we would get, and they would come in, late afternoon, early evening for the, especially Thursdays were the day. And hours, they'd come in very important. They're very important people, hedge fund managers and whatnot. And lo and behold, by 2 a.m., 2 in the morning, they are a completely different person. Yes. And what a window into psychology. I can say it was fascinating. And like I said, a half joke, but really, I got to see so much, and I got to learn so much about people by working at a bar.
Yeah, the worst thing for me is I used to play rugby for a club in the same town as a bar I used to work in, and I knew if we had a win, my night was going to be very hard.
Yeah, there you go. But you'd make a lot of money, hopefully. Good. So we have that in common, which is
fantastic.
Great.
That amongst many other things, I imagine.
That's right. It's not just that, but I give that advice to students and young people I mentor is go work in. It doesn't have to be a bar, obviously, but go work in hospitality for sure.
Yes.
Great. So let's pivot then. Let's talk about something that I believe was just released yesterday or within the last couple of days. And it was senators in the U.S. and this was almost 1 year exactly after Mark Zuckerberg was brought to Congress and had to testify, and they passed this legislation on what they call dark patterns and this overall ban on manipulative data gathering. And so I knew a little bit about it, not a whole lot, but I've been reading since the announcement. And these dark patterns, as they call them, are the use of defaults and other possibly exploitative behavioral psychological tactics to pull out certain personal data, both demographic, personality, and psychographic data from people. And there's the big tech companies we think of that are gathering our information, our personal information, our personal data. But it's happening, all the time. We give over that information, we give over that data quite readily, and they do so in such a way that it is construed as manipulative. So now they're coming around and saying these behavioral insights tactics are exploitative, and we have to be very concerned about that. So as we kicked off our conversation offline before we hit the record button, I was saying that so many of the people in the behavior change and the behavior science, behavior design space are really in it to do good. You always hear of behavior change for good. You never hear behavior change for bad. And yet that behavior change for bad is out there, and it's happening. So I'm just curious, to very high level question to start off with. What are your thoughts about the type of behavioral insights tactics that are being used, especially when it comes to big tech, and what can we do to guard ourselves as a field?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's still, with a lot of work that's been done on reinforcing an ethical approach to applied behavioural science, it still is a space that there's work for us to still do. And I think there's two elements. For me, there's two elements of your question. The first is what data is available, and are people knowingly providing or arming other organisations or tech platforms with data that otherwise they wouldn't feel comfortable with sharing. So I think one element is, are people aware of the data that's being captured and disseminated, and how can we increase the control that people have over their personal information and be mindful of where this might go? And I think the second is then to what is the end that this data is being used. And whether it's dark patterns, or Richard Thaler will talk about sludges within a specific objective, then clearly as practitioners we need to be mindful as to what our end goal might be, and what's the ultimate objective, and where is this data coming from that we may or may not have access to.
Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of one of the principles of Dick Thaler's nudging for good, again, is full transparency. One, and what's more relevant here is that the person being nudged, or in this case, the person from which personal data is being gathered, is to the benefit of that individual. Now, why I see that as a concern, or why it's a thorny issue, is because what individual or what body of people are deciding, are setting out, saying this is what it means to the person who's being nudged. This is how we define good, because good could be construed as just increasing shareholder value, improving the bottom line. So how do we decide as a field? Do we need sort of an ethical standard, and how do we put that in place to ensure indeed that it is behavior change for good?
Yeah, and also I think within that, how do we bring the sort of the more contemporary world of behavioural science into alignment with practice that's been accepted, that continues to be rolled out across the globe, that we might consider as being behavioural in nature, but is around capitalist transactions. So a recommended retail price with a big red line through it, that's an anchoring heuristic, and it's not surfaced over the last decade. If we think of a closing down sale, we might say that's a scarcity driver, but still that could be a nudge to transact or drive a volume of sales within a company or within a store. So I think what's important for us is to sort of see where are some of the universalities, I think, of accepted behavioural techniques, And also, I mean, let's challenge ourselves to see if there is accepted practice that we didn't realise why things were effective, or why they've sort of propagated over time, that we need to reconsider and help to legislate against. But I think sometimes when we look at it through the lens of a science, and we build a vernacular and a language around it, it might feel that it's something that's completely new to us. But in many instances, we've evolved as companies, as organizations, as brands, as sales technicians, to apply this thinking organically and inadvertently. So that distinction, I think, is important as well.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard, actually just this morning on a national broadcast in Canada, CBC, they were talking with a professor of information technology, I believe. And in his book, he talks about, just ensuring that these companies, that there's these practices and that they have to comply with and abide by. And one of those, he was saying, is giving a timeline to having an amount of time that they have to work with the data, or to sit, on that data. And it's a similar practice that is actually borrowed from different university and research institutions, where they are mandated to discard and get rid of any data after a certain period of time.
Yeah.
Now in the private sector, they don't have to do that. They can literally sit on that data, and in fact, it's cheaper for them to retain personal data than it is to get rid of it. But if we have something in place that says, you have to get rid of it after X number of years, as opposed to saving it in case, just in case, so that they can then scrape it for whatever commercial purposes, I think it's practices like that will ensure we're maintaining some sort of ethical guidelines.
Yes, certainly, and I suppose then it's whether that's attributable to an individual, and I couldn't profess to be sort of the expert on GDPR, but processes that are coming through in that nature, to make sure data is maintained and recorded and held accordingly. I think that's critical.
Absolutely, and GDPR, I think, is we're seeing trickles of that come to Canada and come to North America, but we're very, very far behind compared to what you guys have in place in some of the European countries. And some of my client work, which is global, there's I've interacted with clients in different European countries, and I have proposed some measures that we collect on employee performance, let's say, or the ability to perform in a workplace, and gather metrics associated with productivity and focus and whatnot. And it's been completely shut down, and they're just like, nope, that's just far too sensitive of personal data to collect, even though it's the data is anonymous, and even though it's only analyzed on the aggregate level and all these things. So they're as frustrating it is as it is to me, because I want to know, I'm curious as a psychologist to get those information. It's also it's makes me optimistic, and it makes me hopeful, makes me feel hopeful that there are these checks and balances in place, and that we're thinking about these things. So that's great. Good start. And now I want to pivot a bit. You have this organizational psychology background, right? You have a master's.
Yes.
So I'm curious of this, what some people, and this might be a little bit overblown, but what some people are calling this the behavioral revolution. In the last decade or so, especially the last 5 years, we see BE, BS, BD, BI, whatever you want to call it. We see it. It's really has blown up in different industries and different markets. So we've entered into the applied world, and I think we're doing a decent job. And as many of my listeners know, that's the impetus of this podcast. And yet it's nothing new. It's not like we invented a field. And in fact, there's been a dedicated applied field in psychology and behavioral science for a very long time. And we call it IO psychology or occupational psychology. But really, it never had the impact that we see behavioral science or behavioral economics now having. Why do you think? And I'm curious why that's the case. Is it a branding thing? As you're an expert in branding and marketing, is it that the BE people marketed it well, whereas the IO folks didn't, and they let the ball drop? Or is it more of a perfect storm of accidents that came together?
I think it might be a mixture of both. Really good question, and I think you're right. And often when we talk about behavioural science, and I've touched on it even now just in this conversation, many of the principles, the techniques that we now sort of pull into the bucket of behavioural science, which is a large bucket containing subdisciplines of psychology, social psychology, cognitive psychology, behavioural economics, sort of quite a broad field that I see within behavioural science. This is stuff that's not explicitly new. And to answer your question, I think there is a really powerful role of the rebrand, or the specific focus of psychological principles within economic decision making through behavioural economics, that has given it a frame that's made it feel more tangible, concrete, more predictable, more transactional, like the sort of the laws of supply and demand, the sort of language that can excuse it being spoken in a boardroom and not just in sort of psychological circles or on a counselling couch. And I think that language and again with various things that have come together, I think, over the last decade, but certainly the field and the popularization of behavioral economics, but also the work of teams like the Behavioural Insights team just down the river from us here in London, sort of really formally introduced and supported by governments, creating really pragmatic frameworks like Mindspace and East that help us sort of codify and create a new vernacular around some of the things that we might have understood intuitively, or we may have seen in sub-chapters of a psychology textbook, to make it feel more like a common code by which we can explore the world a little bit more easily. And I think that's helped to bridge the gap between sort of complex theory or the realms of sort of theory alone to a school that can be quite practical, predictable, testable, and tangible. And I think, and we know from behavioural science that that's attractive, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a bit of a combination.
Mm-hmm. So we've made it more accessible to the non-scientist.
Well, I think we've made it both attractive and accessible. So I think we've given the scientists hopefully a more powerful platform to communicate its value. Mm-hmm. By giving it, by putting it in the realms of economic value, like supply and demand. You can sort of talk about social norming just as you might a distribution strategy, mm-hmm. right? So you're able to sort of change the room in which you're able to be spoken to, of.
Do you think it? So I guess it then takes what is typically seen as more, and I hate this term as a psychologist, but soft constructs and soft phenomena, and it slaps on sort of a more a veneer of economics and money and ROI, and all of a sudden you have the attention of people who would otherwise dismiss what is fluffy or totally has no space in business.
Can you imagine? And for us as a practice, it enables us to talk about things that otherwise you might be walked out of the room for. Mm-hmm. Right, and if you can start to use the discipline to bridge the gap between economic decision making and more subtle influences of behaviour that pose quite counterintuitive questions to what we might consider rationally or logically, but be put in the same ballpark as prospect theory, that does help to encourage people to think beyond what they might be able to consciously recognise within themselves. To less obvious, less intuitive drivers of behaviour that from our perspective, can not only be sort of immensely effective, but can help us to generate far more creative ideas for organisations and brands that we may have ever been able to do before.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder how much is just in the term alone behaviour, because this is really coming out of BE. Behavioral economics, and it follows or it tracks the progression of the field of psychology at large, where in the 20s and 30s you had this so-called behavioral revolution, Watson and Skinner, and they were the ones saying, we don't
Mm.
care about the black box. We don't care about the inner workings of the mind. We don't care about introspection. We care about the things that we can observe,
Yes.
measure, and those are the things that are amenable to scientific hypothesis testing. And I think we're in this weird way, we're sort of reliving that history as we
Yes.
now put this field in practice. Because I think for the IO folks who must be discouraged by this at some level, maybe, that perhaps their stuff
I
was
don't
a little
know.
bit too
I think,
introspective.
speaking from that school, and
Mm-hmm.
I've only practiced for a short amount of time in honesty as a legitimate industrial or organisational site. But I think I'd be surprised if that sort of field is frowning upon its growth. I think it's expanding the relevance of
Mm-hmm.
that practice. I think, but you're right. It's interesting to say, sort of, from we don't really want to understand within the black box. We just want to measure it. Now we want to better understand why the measurement occurred, so we can scale it. But so it's an interesting space in which we're in.
Mm-hmm. And as you know, behavior is just one outcome variable, one output that we can observe and that we can measure, and it lends itself to something that's probably a little bit more objective compared to, say, self-report or personality measurement. But now we find ourselves with technologies of neuroscience, of giving us the ability to peer inside that black box, not just through cognitive reaction time tasks, but now we can peer inside and see brain process and brain activity. And that had its heyday in the academic world in the early 2000s and for 10 or 15 years. And I think that neuro hype has dialed down a bit in research, but I see the echoes of that now happening in industry and in practice. And I'm curious if you guys, and in your business, if the whole quote unquote neuro marketing has made its way, and if it's impacted the type of conversations you have with prospective or existing clients, and how you see that distinction between behavior and behavioral insights versus neuro insights. Curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think, so firstly, it's not an area explicitly that we've explored insofar as sort of EEG measures and tracking neural activity. I think closer to the looking at the literature around why this might be the case as a result of neural activity to predict responses. But so neuromarketing is not an area that we as a practice have moved into. The distinction, if I'm remembering and answering your question right here, Nick, but then from sort of a behavioural insight that might be more universalities, I suppose, across individuals. So trying to understand how more of us, what we sort of more of us have in common, I suppose, with different circumstances, environments, or contexts that we might be in. That's really what we're focused on for a number of years here. And we're getting a little bit closer to looking at, okay, so within the sort of the sense of these universalities of behaviour, how might they flex based on worldview, based on personality attributes, based on sort of perceptions of locus of control, and these might influence the relevance of what might be considered a more universal lever. But into the specifics of we showed X consumer this brand, or we put this individual in this particular context to recycle or conduct an explicit behaviour, and their brain lit up. That's not an area that we're currently playing within.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's actually one that I struggle with, because I do see some organizations and some companies doing a decent job of the brain science and the neuroscience, and but unfortunately I see most of them guilty of this neuro babble, let's call it, where they're not doing anything with the actual neuroscience. They're just recognizing that to slap a brain on a deck,
yes,
or to talk about the brain is sexy.
Yeah.
And I think they're just capitalizing on that. And there's actually one study, I might be misremembering a little or misreporting it here, but the gist is that you gave this set of findings to
Yeah.
a person, and one they had the image of the brain, and then the other treatment they didn't, and those who had the image of the brain rated it as more credible and
Incredible.
more
Yeah.
truth. So there's something about the brain that captures people's attention, I think.
No, and I think you're absolutely right, and I recall that study, and to, but I do think in speaking. So if we engage clients, as I suspect many people practicing in our field would, it is important to talk about the brain. It's important to talk about evolution and why some of these hardwired heuristics have exist, and how they're very helpful, and how what might be considered as sort of a system to engagement is costly, expensive. It costs lots of sugar, lots of glucose, which is sort of why we tend not to use it as much as we think we might use it. I think being able to speak to some of the physiology is really important, but for us to I mean, from my history, from my understanding, and I haven't ventured as deeply into its explicit sort of neuro, is that the tools that we have to use these are still so blunt. That we can create patterns, and as you say, we can create sort of really compelling visual sort of presentations and sell. But I'm not yet sure that we can confidently say, because it was this area of the nucleus accumbens that shone when we made the pound signs a little bit smaller. What we can do is test hypotheses and have a suspicion as to the emotional response as to why this might be driving, but we don't go into that level of detail, fundamentally because we're not qualified to go there, and we haven't found it so helpful to staff ourselves in that way.
I think the pendulum is swinging on the other side, at least in academia and now in industry as well, where there was hype around the brain. But I think folks are realizing that it's just one other thing that we can use, and the tools that we can use to see and to sort of glean insights from it. But it doesn't, just because we're seeing some sort of biological reality, we're seeing this organ in between our ears, doesn't mean that it's more true or more interesting or more relevant than insights that we draw from psychology or behavior. It's all the same thing. It's all coming from the same source,
Yeah. So, and this is where I agree with you completely. But I think sort of the closer we can get to the root cause. I mean, I do have a passion for the brain, obviously. So the closer we can get to understanding the physiological functions that's driving a response, I think amazing, because we know sometimes there are so many other factors at play that influence our behaviour, that impact replication, that sort of muddy a real world contextual intervention. So the closer we can get to pinpointing the neural activity that we're looking to drive, the better. I just think that's still incredibly hard, and certainly incredibly hard for clients and practically. And I suppose an interesting sort of journey that we're on also is how do we make this thinking practical? How do we help engage people that don't spend all of their time in this discipline to ideate from it? How can we be fast in bringing things to market, because we're playing in many instances within a competitive commercial realm as much as we work within a pro-social realm. So these are some factors that sort of prevent the opportunity, I think, from doing such. I mean, I'm sure there's a better word than hardcore study, but it really is, right.
And you've been in your business at Ogilvy in the role you're in currently, and similar roles prior to that. Have you noticed a change in the appetite from the market, from folks who don't have the behavioral science background or the behavioral blank background? Have you noticed, say, in the last 5 years, that there's more appetite to begin talking about these things and to begin applying these solutions?
Yeah, I think certainly, and the popular. I mean, a couple of Nobel prizes also really help, right?
That's true.
in bringing this to popular culture, and certainly where I'm speaking from now in the UK, the the adoption of the government for a number of years to normalise it and give the discipline credibility sort of starts to lower the risk of entering into our category. But what I think I've been particularly thrilled with is the diversity of the sorts of organisations and categories that are starting to look to this space. So from marketing departments, obviously government and policy centres, through to safety advisors, through to security expertise, through to embedding this thinking within user experience and product design. I think that's one of the areas that I think is most exciting, is the diversity of the sorts of people who are now starting to experiment within their own domains to reinforce the discipline and to challenge the theory that has been written before. And as we talk about sort of the revolution of behavioural science, I also think historically this has been driven by academia and then and now government. And I think the private sector now has a responsibility to continue that learning journey and to road test some of the theory that's been developed with Western samples in universities over the course of a few decades. And I think big data through big business and experimental mindsets and some risk taking within the private sector that might be harder to make within government practice, I think only hopes to extend the relevance of applied BA. So that's exciting for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It is, and it's early days, really. It feels like, for folks like you and I, and we have sort of a different trajectory, but we find ourselves now in similar spaces. It feels like it's been around for a while, but if you look at the bigger perspective, I mean, we are really in our infancy, and the hope, I think, from us is that we do a good job now. And we form and build that solid foundation, so that into the future we can really rely on a credible science and a credible field. So, and I think
there are two ways. Just to jump, I think there are two ways in which sometimes we can look at the discipline as being this, or we could be seeking sort of bulletproof solutions. And as you say, sort of working towards a more robust understanding of human behaviour, but sort of the closest to a universal model. But I think on the way, I think there's value to be found in the science that has come before us and some of the insights that are available to enable us, encourage us to test things and experiment in ways that we would never have done before. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, again, we know sometimes this may not explicitly be replicated, and there's so many complexities in certainly in a public sector. If we think of the environment in which something would be executed, a brand that might be affiliated. If we think about pro-social work that we're lucky to do across the world, there's huge cultural differences in the application of some of this theory that will take a long time, I think, for us to have a clear point of view. So in the interim, I think it's behavioural science can arm us with a bit of a checklist, a bit of a pilot's checklist of things that we should consider, and things that we might be daft not testing to achieve our end goal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you guys at Ogilvy do some incredible projects, and I'm now in my own work and just in my own thinking starting to dive into more brand related projects and engagements. So I'm just curious, what and you guys do so much, but if you had to choose one, or maybe I'll give you two, what's been your favorite project or projects in the last year? And if you can, I'd be happy to hear.
Yeah, of course. And I think and thank you. And I think what surprised me also as our practice has evolved within Ogilvy, that is classically a big advertising agency. What's been interesting for us, and I think really compelling for our business, is the work that we're doing that is actually away from from branded activity, away from sort of explicit commercials, and becoming a bridge into parts of businesses that a creative entity typically wouldn't be welcomed into. And one of the pieces I think was the most fun, I think, this year was in safety, looking at factory safety. Again, it's sort of, imagine sort of 5 years ago, someone opening up their factory to an advertising agency to help sort of increase safety procedures and see how we might change the processes and products to ensure people come home safely every day. It's just not the kind of question we would be asked. But we were lucky to do a lot of work with a client over North America and Canada. I was actually lucky to visit, if it's your hometown, certainly where you are, in Toronto for some work. And the challenge here that we faced was really high familiarity, high repetition work. And that's sort of classic factory work. We're talking about 12-hour shifts, 4 days a week, 30 years tenure for many of the people that we met and work with during this project. And what's really interesting when we look at risk and safety is that one of the factors that can lead to injury and damage or risk is actually familiarity. I think a third of car accidents occur a mile from your home, right? So as we become more familiar, as we might shift in from sort of system 2 engagement to quite comfortably system 1 autopilot, we can disengage, and this is where we might be tripped up. And what's really interesting in the real world, we can see, well, there are some solutions that have looked to engage our system 2, and I shouldn't be talking in systems, but basically knocking us out of autopilot and deflecting from familiarity. And many of our listeners, or your listeners, and yourself, will sort of know Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. Richard Thaler, Cass Sunstein write about it in Nudge. Long stretch of road with a sharp bend on the end. They found that people were taking the stretch too fast and careering off the bend. They tried to reduce speed limits. They tried to increase the fines, and often say with the windows down and a good song in the background, that people take the straight too fast and career off the bend. So what they did was use what's known as an avenue effect. So it's sort of, you often experience this when you're driving on a road with trees planted next to it. They painted a series of white lines on the road, and they get closer and closer together. The closer you get to the corner, and actually it's the experience of feeling like you're driving too fast because of the lines that make you slow down. So rather than educating, rather than informing people that they're driving dangerously, the context itself made people want to slow down. And one more before I sort of get to the solution, but it's all sort of helped us here, was some work that was conducted in advance of the Rio Olympics. It's the first Olympics to actually ban men from wearing headgear in boxing. They found that men are actually more likely to get a concussion in boxing with a headgear, because we have a false sort of risk compensation. So we put ourselves in more dangerous circumstances because we feel that we're invincible. And I think the same is often true of cyclists that sort of don cycling gear, and now they're kitted and they're ready to roll. But what's really interesting about both of these examples now, if we move back to a safety context, is every day we're arming our workers with hard hats and high-vis vests and goggles and steel cap boots and safety gloves. As they move into high repetition, high familiarity work, are we creating a cocktail for that's actually more conducive with psychological risk taking, even though people might be physically protected? So one sort of really simple piece of work that we've since trialled is basically just making a set of what we call vulnerable personal protective equipment. So it's personal protective equipment that just reminds people that they have toes in their boots and a soft brain inside that skull cap, and delicate fingers inside those gloves. They're not tools; those are just your fingers that are covered up. So we developed a series of gloves. We focused on gloves for some time to just experiment with different cues on the gloves, So one was like a skeleton hand glove,
Hmm.
or other gloves just had simple fingernails on the tips of the glove, just a subtle cue to remind you that you're more vulnerable than you might think. And we trialed those in a big factory to make sure that there weren't any sort of icebergs with the introduction of these designs. And safety is a really interesting one and a difficult one to measure because thankfully, because it's hopefully in many instances a low baseline of injuries, it's a very hard space to get significance and sort of validation. So what we did was develop just a simple online survey that exposed people with different styles of injuries with different conditions. So one condition was a bare hand. Another condition that some people would get was like a normal glove. And then we had our independent condition, our test condition being a skeleton hand glove. And what we found, well, we tested these through a series of different injuries, so like a drop saw, a hand saw, or a box cutter, to assess people's perception of vulnerability to injury. Unsurprisingly, there wasn't a massive difference in perceptions of vulnerability for a big drop saw, which sort of makes sense in retrospect. Because if you have a drop saw injury with a bare hand or with a gloved hand, you're probably going to have the same have the same sort of outcome, right? You're losing your fingers.
Yeah.
With a hand saw, we found a 20% boost in vulnerability with a bare hand versus a gloved hand, which was really encouraging for us. So it sort of shared that our paradigm was working on the platform. But when we looked at the box cutter or like a Stanley knife, we found that the bare hand was far more vulnerable. I think about 40% more vulnerable than a gloved hand. And our skeleton glove hand was 13% more vulnerable than a normal gloved hand. So that's a sort of, I think, a 95% confidence interval. So designing the glove differently reinforced what was a safety glove with a psychological sort of cue to help people sort of realize that they were vulnerable. I know that's a long story, Nick, but it's fascinating. It's a lovely space in which actually the solution is just painting some bones on the outside of a glove to remind your brain that you're vulnerable, and we wouldn't be able to, as I mentioned initially, to walk into a factory and say, what we need to do, guys, is make your team feel like they're at risk. Yeah. Can you imagine doing that? And you'd be shown the door.
Yeah.
Right? But because we're able to tell the narrative, because we can talk Lakeshore Drive, because there's a term, the Avenue effect, because we can reference risk compensation with the Rio Olympics, we can encourage people to believe that something as simple as painting a fingernail on a safety glove can actually make a real difference, and it can.
I love that's amazing, actually. And when that's a space for me that I'm not so familiar with, and I've seen it pop up, so it seems to be gaining a little bit of traction. And so I'm glad that you actually offered that as your example, and that Ogilvy's doing it is incredible.
But what for me, I'm particularly proud of it because it's, as I said, it's an area that people wouldn't consider us as belonging normally. But there is certainly a problem that psychology and behavioural science can help to solve. Psychology and creativity can help to solve. And if we're experts in solving problems with psychology and creativity, then our problems are sort of limitless there. So I'm pleased. We're talking about whether we've coined a new category there. We often talk about ergonomics being sort of everything, the interaction from the neck down. So we'll have ergonomically designed chairs, ergonomically designed sort of garlic presses. If you think about behavioural economics, it tends to be from the neck up. Right? How our brain responds to certain circumstances, how we perceive risk, how we sort of make decisions in complex worlds. But we wonder whether or not we've actually created sort of behavioural ergonomics by reinforcing ergonomic design with psychological cues to make them stronger together.
Very, very cool. And why I love it, one reason why I love it is because it's the reason why I got into psychology, years ago in my undergraduate, was because it's these small changes, these tiny little alterations in often in perception or in framing, that can lead to such big and interesting outcomes downstream. And for me, I don't know, I still sort of gleefully smile and just, I'm so full of mirth when I hear those types of things, because it's so simple yet it's so elegant, and you can design it too.
Rory Sutherland, who's our founder, has a term, we term them mono ideas. So they're minimalist, non-obvious ideas. Recently we did some work with Costa Coffee, with Heathrow Airport, to see how we can help Costa reach their recycling objectives, using Heathrow Airport as a really great test base, as a contained environment which we can trial different interventions to help Costa Coffee increase the number of cups that are recycled. And the simplest, I think, the most beautifully simple solution to be rolled out every time we go to a Costa or a Starbucks or a Neuro or wherever you might be getting takeaway coffee. They ask you if you want it in a takeaway cup. Right? And the simplest thing we can start saying is, would you like it in a recyclable cup? And it costs really nothing, right? But it's the right incision, with a subtle solution at the right point in time, and it's totally changed. And forgive me, tell me if I'm waffling now, because I'm starting to get excited. But it's totally redefined my definition of creativity. So I come from a psychology background, moved into broader advertising strategy, so worked very closely on big advertising campaigns and sort of platform ideas, and you get excited by Cannes every year, and I still do. But my definition of creativity has warped completely. Right? That I can get goosebumps when someone says, let's call it a recyclable cup. I can get goosebumps and someone says, okay, in this particular form, we want them to speed up when they're reading this and slow down so they really observe and read that. So let's have ticks for that part of the form, but have empty bullet holes for that part of the form, because we just know that's how we process information. And for me, that's like uber creative, right? And it's how we can bring these small, subtle shifts that it sort of drive far greater returns, the investment or the impact on the experience should really.
And it speaks to this marriage of behavioral science and behavioral design. And so I actually wanted to talk to you about that. I've talked to a few of my guests, and I've been having conversations with folks about this for about the past 6 months or a year, because it's really in this time that I'm seeing people call the work that they do behavioral design, as opposed to, say behavioral science or behavioral economics or behavioral insights. And that's a really big difference. And I think I'm on the one hand, I'm very excited that those two worlds are coming together, just as you laid out, the sort of the creativity element of slapping the creativity on top of the science, I think is the coolest part. And you're going to have some people who are better on one end versus the other. But on the other hand, I'm meeting with a bit of hesitation or reservations because it's now making me wonder, well, from a talent perspective, how do we build teams, like a behavioral change team? Do we find the behavioral designers? Do we find the behavioral scientists? Or, probably it's a mix. But have you guys thought about that in your business and at Ogilvy? And because I think you guys are sort of like at that perfect intersection.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question and a tough question. And at the moment, we haven't sort of been building explicit sort of behavioural design capability. I mean, we're lucky within Ogilvy that we work in a huge company with designers, with copywriters, with art directors. So, but there is and I'm not suggesting that a behavioural designer is just a designer that knows behavioural science, but by any means. But it's not a space that we've explicitly sort of hired for. I think what I think is our point of difference, and I don't want this to be a sales pitch, but it's as much about what are the things that make a team of people want to come to work for every day, right? That's part of it. And I think for us, it's the diversity of the sorts of problems that we can be asked to solve. And sometimes these are design solutions. Sometimes these are copy solutions. Sometimes it can be unconscious bias training to remove sort of bias from recruitment, promotion, and remuneration decisions. But because we're able to throw our hand and bring these insights to so many interesting categories, we can, I think, fundamentally be more creative with them. Right. So we had, again, let's go back to factory safety. And one of the challenges we're working with in safety also is about communication in factories. And some of the challenges with encouraging what is a largely male workforce to say, stop, Nick, you're about to hurt yourself, or stop, Nick, you're going to hurt your back if you lift that, right? Because what that sort of tends to do is not occur, but partly because it's sort of almost an implicit challenge to that relationship, an implicit challenge to that camaraderie that might exist, because you're fundamentally questioning someone's ability. So you tend to sort of give faith. So what we developed was a safe word. So we developed a word that everyone in the factory had bought into, that it's like we're giving ourselves permission to intervene when we see something that's unsafe, because we've normalized this safe word. And so a couple of weeks later, then I was working with a government organisation here in London around mental health. And one of the challenges with men speaking up about mental health. And you sort of go, well, actually, there might be a thing for this, right? Where we're working in one department at factory safety, and it's about communication in high risk, high male dominated, in many instances, in environments. I'm wondering what we can borrow from that category and reapply it in mental health. And I think by having the diversity of these sorts of challenges, you're able to be more creative in their adaptation. And I think you touched on this, Nick, but I think creativity is certainly critical for us, because it helps us to stay ahead of the behaviour, keeps us ahead of the curve. How many times have we seen sort of 4 seats left at this price? How many times have we seen sort of unclick this box to unsubscribe? These are all things that you might consider behavioural solutions, but they're elements that people are becoming. They're becoming hygiene factors. They're non-competitive, and I think less effective, and because they're exposed, right? And as we can start to think of creative ways in which we can influence behaviour and step ahead of the behaviour, that's a real role for creativity, and again a role for the private sector to progress the discipline, I think.
And I totally agree with you. And to be totally frank, even a year ago, I would have probably said I would have been singing a bit of a different tune. I'm sort of dogmatic in being a trained scientist, and so when I saw, as I've been living and observing the world of behavioral economics and behavioral insights, I was always paying close attention to the science and to RCTs and data collection and quantifying and measuring things, et cetera, et cetera. And I was letting my biases prevent me from seeing all the other tools that we have in our toolkit to understand human behavior, and one of them being the creative part and the design aspect, which I'm terrible at, and I would never pretend to be good at it, and the other being the qualitative aspect of data collection, which I'm glad to see is now coming into the space of applied behavioral science and behavioral economics. But you asked somebody that 2 years ago, is there, should we be doing qualitative in combination with quantitative? And they would scoff at you.
Yeah. And for me, sorry, mate, you go.
No, I'm just saying sort of it speaks to the trends, the again, going back to we're a nascent field and we're sort of growing pains, I think.
But also I think it can be a great conduit to bring, as you say, departments together or fields of research together that otherwise wouldn't so neatly sit together. And I think your example of sort of bringing quantitative and qualitative insight into surround a problem, but speaking the same vernacular, I think is how we progress. And so frameworks or behavioural frameworks, you can help to synthesize what is a data insight to be indicative of a barrier or a driver, just as a qual insight to be indicative of a barrier or a driver, and make an assumption based on a critical framework that we think is most relevant to the challenge. So it can be a bit of a Rosetta Stone of insight sometimes,
and I think
builds to come together.
Sorry, I think we are like as practitioners well suited to bring those walls down between industries, because in academia it's highly siloed. The social, let's take social science as one example. The sociologists don't talk to the psychologists, who don't talk to the neuroscientists, who don't talk to the management. And there's exceptions to that, of course, I recognize. Yes. But for the most part, they publish in their own journals. They attend their own conferences, and yet they're studying the exact same thing. They're just studying human behavior, and albeit in a different way, and applying different tools and methodologies. So I actually am hopeful that coming together of different disciplines it's much more amenable for that to happen in practice in the firms and the organizations that we work in than it is in academia, just because of the incentive structures of academia versus in business. And so that's so exciting, because it's at those intersections, it's at those boundaries where the real, solutions are and the puzzles are solved. And
for us, one of the opportunities, but also the challenges is how we bring that sort of right deep expertise in at the right time. So how do we define the challenges, where I often sort of articulate our team as a sort of specialist generalists, right? So we've got a deep expertise, and we've got a team of psychologists, behavioural economists, sort of human geographers, human biologists, so really eclectic mix of different thinkers, but but there are often briefs that just go, actually, let's tap into a UCL or an LSE to bring us an area that's sort of, you don't know what you don't know. And I think being able to commercialize their input and bring, actually, as you say, industries together that otherwise wouldn't meet is hugely exciting, and something that we're doing more and more of now, as I think clients and partners are arming us with the ability really to on occasions, it goes down to spending money, right? And bringing value into this academic point of view. Often costs money, and now there is the appetite to make sure this is the case, and it's super exciting.
Exciting times indeed. Final question for you, Sam, if you don't mind.
Yes. No, of course.
Okay. And I know we could go on forever, but good times must end. So what I call the BBB, I ask this of all my guests, the big behavioral brainstorm. So it's quite obvious to many people that there's a lot of problems in the world, and they need to be solved. Where do you see, what space or what problem in particular? You could be as specific or general in your response as you like. Do you see behavioral insights or behavioral design or behavioral science, whatever you want to call it, playing a big role?
And do I, in response, do I need to have the answers? I've certainly got a territory, and I don't have the answers yet.
That's even better.
Good. Because I don't think, and whether this is obviously this is probably not going to be unique, but clearly the climate change or the climate emergency is a territory that is ripe for us in informing, sort of framing the challenge in a way, and even the clever reframe now to climate emergency, right? That's I might bucket that down to behavioural science, right? But ways in which we can motivate individuals or frame the challenge that we face in a way that's most relevant, most motivating, most attainable. I think one of the biggest challenges here we face is a degree of self-efficacy, an assumption that a sort of a social loafing that exists, that someone else might solve it, and the perception of the inability of anything that I might do to make a difference, or a drop in the ocean. So I think there's many different facets to how we'll start to eat this elephant sort of one leg at a time, in creating sort of opt-in services that can start to change sort of behaviour at scale. I think one of the biggest impacts, or the element that will have the biggest impact, I think, is clearly policy, but we can start to enable people to make sort of personal commitments and change electricity providers to change how they function with hard defaults, to help again move in front of where policy might take us. I think there's a space addressing the delayed gratification of this benefit. Again, it's like, yes, I believe this is a good thing, but I need to drive my car now, or I just need to be in New York for a meeting now. How can we start to bring the impacts of these behaviours more saliently and tangibly? So I'm conscious I haven't articulated it well at all, but certainly it's an area that needs us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree, and it's even here in Canada. We're recently out of a federal election, which was a bit of a mess and a bit of all over the place, and on top of mind for a lot of people in the election period was climate. And we have a party here called what they're worldwide, but the Green Party. The Green Party's always been around, but they haven't had many seats in the House, and this is I believe their most successful election period to date, but it was still a very small number of seats that they won. And a lot of it is because people have, I wouldn't pretend to call it a false dichotomy, but it's either you are in favor of green policy or you're in favor of what was I going to say? Physical resources and the economy. So in the west in the prairies of Canada, there's oil and natural gas is our primary resource for export, and it's you either favor that or you favor green. And if you favor green, then that means you're necessarily opposing pipelines, let's say. And that is so tough. And I wouldn't pretend to say that we have the answers, but I think something like this is going to require all hands on deck and all levels of analysis, behavioral science being one.
Yeah, and part of that, as you say, could be bringing parties together to see how they could be mutually beneficial. I know that sounds like an oddity, but the concern is that different sectors rust on to beliefs, or groups of individuals rust on to beliefs and become more extremist, for lack of a better term, to make universal change much harder.
That's right. Especially, obviously with climate being a partisan issue.
Yes.
That's also not helping. Well, you were right when you said you didn't have the answer.
No, I don't have the answer.
How dare you?
I'm not even sure if I've clearly articulated the problem.
The question,
but certainly, I mean, it's a wicked complex. It's the problem of the times, right?
Yeah.
Not just the times. It's the problem of our time.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, there are some significant decisions that I think can be made at a policy level. But there are things that we can be doing that many of us believe are the right ways of conducting ourselves and living our lives that still aren't occurring.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a massive sort of efficacy gap that we can start to address.
Yeah, and even myself, like I'm a trained psychologist, and I'd like to think that I know a lot about behavior change and biases and heuristics and all these sorts of things and nudging and even for years, my own behavior, I didn't change. Like I would be the first person to recognize the importance of, living a greener life and just in my own private and personal life. And yet I never really applied those changes. And it's only honestly within the last 6 months, I'd say that I'm taking more of a concerted effort to change my own behavior.
Yes.
And so that speaks to how difficult it is. I'm a so-called expert, and I should be the one who knows the pitfalls and the difficulties and the complexities. And so what does that mean for just your average person who knows nothing about heuristics and behavioral change? It suggests that you need the context setting.
We do it totally. We do a lot of work in the UK on food waste. And it's one of those, it's another, obviously a big contributor to greenhouse gas, but it's seen to be quite an intangible connection. And there's an interesting relationship that we have with food that we've sort of, if we've bought it, we own it, we can sort of do what we want with it. And it's amazing. I mean, we've been working with food waste for a number of years. And there are still instances where I say, how am I doing this right? I'm literally spending half of my time on food waste, and I still find myself throwing out an old lasagna. Mm-hmm. So some things are just hard to reach. And that doesn't mean we stop trying. But as you say, if it was easy, this problem would be solved. And sometimes certainly we often say, and a lovely sort of Roryism, who's our founder, if the project was logical or rational, we would have solved it already as well. So if nothing else, it gives us more permission to ask illogical, slightly counterintuitive questions of our challenges, like how do we make people feel at more risk? That might actually be the way in which we start to shift the dial.
Yeah. Well, humans are complex, and what that means is we have our work cut out for us, and we're going to have a job, which is a good thing.
Let's hope.
All right, Sam. Well, we're over time, but I do really appreciate you in your Friday afternoon and end of the week taking the time to chat with me. It's been a lot of fun.
It's such a pleasure. I'm so thrilled we're finally able to connect.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.